One of my favourite parts of All the President's Men is right at the very end. After taking us on a journey of how journalist Woodward and Bernstein uncovered the plot to break in to the Watergate building in Washington DC, and how President Nixon was directly tied in attempts to cover it up, we get this scene. The film was released in 1976, just 2 years after Nixon resigned, and his vice president Gerald Ford was sworn in to replace him. And you can tell, the film doesn't feature an actor playing Nixon or West Wing style walk and talks through the corridors of power. Instead, it's a detached, static movie about how investigative journalists doggedly uncovered the greatest scandal in American political history. That contemporaneous nature of the film means that for many, this wasn't yet history. It was still politics, raw and real in a country ill at ease with itself. So the film ends in headlines, stories still in the newspapers people were reading on their way to work. In this video, we're going to dig into that pattern. Why did it happen? How did it come about? And what did it cost Gerald Ford? The Watergate scandal remains a fascinating and seminal moment in American history, so much so that it's come to define secret and conspiracy. We slap Gate onto the end of every minor scandal that makes it into the news. But before we get to the pardon, what happened during Watergate? Well, let's break it down. It starts in June 1972, when 5 men were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. As investigations unfolded, it became clear that the burglars had connection to Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, the so-called Creep Committee. It gets bad for Nixon when it's revealed that high-ranking officials within his administration were linked to the break-ins. This includes attempts to pressure the FBI and pay hush money to the burglars. All the while, 2 Washington Post journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, worked to uncover the scandal, relying on secret briefings from someone they called Deep Throat, who was later revealed to be Mark Felt, an associate director at the FBI. But what clinched it for Nixon was the release of secret White House tapes, which showed the president and his advisors attempting to cover up their involvement. Faced with impeachment and a collapse of political support, Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974, the only, so far, president to do so. So that's Watergate. It's a fascinating story of power and corruption, and this is the story that All the President's Men tells, and how Nixon ultimately was brought down, which leads us back to Gerald Ford.
Hi!
Come on, I'm not doing a video on Gerald Ford without that clip. As Watergate culminated, Ford had only been vice president for 8 months. He was Nixon's second VP after Spiro Agnew was forced to resign, facing unrelated bribery and tax evasion charges. That meant Ford had never been elected to the vice presidency, and now he hadn't been elected president either. In his first address, Ford acknowledged this directly by asking Americans who couldn't confirm him with their votes to confirm him with their prayers.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule.
So what motivated Ford to pardon Nixon? Well, he clearly wanted to distance himself from that long national nightmare. In his announcement of the pardon, Ford set out his reasons. Firstly, mentioning Nixon's family and his health.
But it is common knowledge that serious allegations and accusations hang like a sword over our former president's head, threatening his health as he tries to reshape his life, a great part of which was spent in the service of this country and by the mandate of its people.
He then suggests that Nixon might not be able to receive a fair trial.
The facts, as I see them, are that a former president of the United States, instead of enjoying equal treatment with any other citizen accused of violating the law, would be cruelly and excessively penalized either in preserving the presumption of his innocence or in obtaining a speedy determination of his guilt.
And then he reflects on how a trial might cause even more discord and division in an already splintered country.
My conscience tells me clearly and certainly that I cannot prolong the bad dreams that continue to reopen a chapter that is closed. My conscience tells me that only I, as president, have the constitutional power to firmly shut and seal this book.
This decision caused Ford's popularity to plummet from 72% approval rating to 49% just days after the pardon was issued. And ultimately, it cost Ford his political career. These three factors, Nixon's health and family, whether or not he could receive a fair trial, and a desire to prevent further turmoil, have remained the generally accepted reasons for why Ford granted the pardon. But how did we get there? Nixon's chief of staff, Alexander Haig, had taken Ford aside in the days before Nixon stepped down. He told Ford that while not his idea, some in the White House had suggested Nixon could agree to leave in return for an agreement that the new president, Gerald Ford, would pardon him. Ford claims that he made no response to this suggestion, which he later feared could be misconstrued to Nixon as them having a deal. A day later, he called Haig and read from a written note, "Nothing we talked about yesterday afternoon should be given any consideration in whatever decision the president may wish to make." Once Nixon was gone and Ford was in office, he clearly saw the pardon as an attractive idea. But it wasn't quite as simple as that. In Barry Worth's 2006 book, 31 Days, we get a fascinating insight into background discussions between Nixon's lawyer Herbert Jack Miller and Ford's personal attorney, Benton Becker. These discussions took place over a number of days, with Miller advocating for Nixon's pardon. Nixon's initial focus was on access to his presidential papers, which he wanted for potentially lucrative memoirs, and as a way to salvage his scorned reputation. The other issue was that a pardon brings with it an implication and admission of guilt. This was something established in a 1915 Supreme Court case, and later in life, Ford would carry a portion of the Burdick versus United States decision in his wallet. Eventually, the two lawyers agreed to some kind of statement. Ford wanted to see Nixon take some kind of responsibility for the potential crimes he'd committed, and others had been convicted of. But Nixon strongly felt he hadn't done anything wrong, and resisted any statement of guilt or complicity. What they settled on was a specific and limited admission from Nixon. "I was wrong in not acting more decisively and more forthrightly in dealing with Watergate, particularly when it reached the stage of judicial proceedings and grew from a political scandal into a national tragedy." "I was disappointed," Ford said when hearing the statement. "I was taking one hell of a risk, and Nixon didn't seem to be responsive at all." To get the negotiations to this point was difficult, and Becker, as Ford's representative, spent many hours shuttling back and forward to California, where the president lived. As the deal was concluding, Becker was invited to meet the president, who, at the end of their conversation, in near tears, thanked him for his work and his conduct. In a particularly human moment, Nixon wanted to give Becker a gift, a token of his appreciation. Nixon said, "I tried to get you a presidential tie-pin and cufflinks with my name on it, but I don't even have them anymore. There's nothing left from my presidency." Despite concerns from his staff about how it could impact him politically, Ford made his decision. It meant the former president would face no legal consequences for his role in this cover-up at the highest levels of government. The pardon was controversial. A poll by Newsweek, just days before it was announced, said that 58% of Americans rejected any kind of pardon. One person who certainly disagreed with the pardon was Ford's own press secretary, Gerald Ford. He resigned immediately after the pardon was issued. When Ford said he was taking a hell of a risk for Nixon, he was right. He paid the price for pardoning Nixon, and on issues such as the petering war in Vietnam and rising inflation. Even before the election, Ford faced a serious challenge for the Republican candidacy from one Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan, the actor?
The 1977 US presidential election saw Ford's eventual defeat to Jimmy Carter. That secured Ford's status as the only person to hold presidential office without being elected president or vice president. A decision which he saw was right for the country ended up being firmly rejected by his fellow Americans. With America's ongoing political scandals, the crisis of Watergate, and Ford's decision to pardon Nixon seems particularly relevant. Watergate raises the question of how we hold power to account. Even as historical opinion has shifted towards Ford, it's hard to disagree with DeHorst, who decades later said, "I would still say I'm exactly where I was 25 years ago, that it set up a double standard of justice." Should Nixon have faced the courts, or was Ford's attempt to heal the nation the right thing to do? If you want to learn more about this fascinating period, check out Barry Worth's book 31 Days. I've also linked to some sources in the description. Thanks for watching.